Hello and welcome to this edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast. I am your host, Jared Mack. With me today is Erik Skopil. We're going to be discussing a whole bunch of things, but first, Erik, how you doing?
You know what, man? If you look outside, we've got some sun,
Nice.
and considering what it's been like recently, not too bad. Plus, we're also living in a world where the Chiefs don't win the Super Bowl every year, so I was pretty okay with that outcome too. I don't know about you.
I didn't really have a real running in the race as a Patriot fan. It didn't really matter who won that game. It was going to be
Sure.
okay regardless, but it was kind of nice. Although I wish it was a better game because after half, it was just we had a whole bunch of people in my place. We were all just kind of goofing around, not even watching the game really.
Yeah, our watch party was the same way, except for a buddy hit $1,000 parlay on the Hopkins touchdown in the last 2 minutes, and so we were at least excited at the very end of the game, which with the first 2 hours were very boring. So
Yeah. And unfortunately, nobody won any of their parlays, including me. So that was unfortunate. But today we'll be discussing the Jadon Canady addition to the Oregon roster. That was a recent transfer portal addition. And we're going to kind of go over some NFL draft stuff because that's what's next on the agenda for a lot of things with the draft combine and then Oregon's pro day at some point probably during April. And then obviously the NFL draft at the end of April. So that'll be a lot of fun. But first, let's go over this Jadon Canady addition for Oregon. Defensive back, a transfer from Ole Miss, was in the portal for, a good amount of time here, like over a month, I think it was.
like almost 6 weeks.
Yeah. And predominantly, it was a full-on defensive back, predominantly played that nickelback kind of role. Interestingly enough, this will be the second time Oregon has taken a nickelback from Ole Miss, as Tysheem Johnson was the other transfer that Oregon took from them a couple years ago. I just want to get your thoughts real quick on it before we kind of maybe dive into more of like the minute details of this edition. I just want to hear what you thought was when you saw him him commit to Oregon randomly on a Monday night, I think it was.
Yeah.
Just what were your thoughts originally, and then what do you think it could be?
Well, I think surprised, like everybody was, just because the timing of it was strange. I mean, Ohio State and Notre Dame were the last team to finish their season, and so they had an extended window. But that was a couple weeks ago that closed, and at that point, and this point in the year, you weren't really expecting to see anybody commit to Oregon based upon what we had seen, and the position fit makes some sense. This is somebody we should note. Chris Hampton recruited and coached at Tulane, years ago. So and this is a Tulane to Ole Miss to Oregon transfer. If you haven't read through all the details, and so I'm going to guess that this was a situation where maybe he was not very well sought after in the portal. Maybe he was surprised and then was like, "Hey, Coach Hampton's looking around, going like, we could use a veteran defensive back. This is somebody I'm comfortable with, and this is not a bad player, by the way." I've seen some people kind of pan the addition, like. There was one publication, at least I think it was with the College Sports Network, that had Cannady as a second-team All-SEC player a year ago. Was, I think, the top player on their team in terms of pass deflections. Was fifth in snaps played for the Rebels last year. This is a player that played a lot on a good defense, obviously in one of the two best conferences in the country. Not going to sit here and say this is a huge step up to what Oregon had before, but a veteran player that has starting experience in the SEC, who has experience with, again, the coordinator or one of the position coaches he'll be working with. So I think all of that makes some sense. Now, I guess I'm curious. Maybe I'll just throw it back to you on this, Jared. It feels like this is a nickel. I think it's probably a good place to add some veteran experience, especially with, let's just say, some lack of clarity with what's going on with the Dalen Austin case that got postponed back to August. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not, frankly, literate enough in the legal stuff to really have a sense of where that process is going. But Dalen Austin was kind of perceived to be, by the two of us, and specifically by you, Jared, when you did your two deep as the likely starter there. Maybe this gives you kind of a nice alternative option if things kind of don't go the way you'd hope in terms of the legal process.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's kind of how I thought of it too. Where again, I don't know anything, Erik. I don't know if you know really anything about what's going on with that case, other than that the legal proceedings all got kind of pushed back and continue to get pushed back. But I think this is just kind of like a safety valve potentially if things go awry there, where if
Mhm.
Dalen is unable to play for the team, you get somebody who has years of starting experience for a Tulane team as a true freshman, played over 700 snaps and was quite good. Was on
Mhm.
the Tulane team and 21 and then that beat USC, I believe it was 21 or either 22. Either way, he
Yeah.
was on the team for that really good Tulane team down there. And then for Ole Miss, comes in as a guy who was supposed to play a lot in his first year with Ole Miss, and then got a knee injury, was out, only played in 2 games, I think it was, but played 624 snaps last year for Ole Miss. And Ole Miss, for as much as people don't like Lane Kiffin and all that jazz, like that was a really good defense last year. They had a lot of
Mhm.
good players up front. They had a good secondary, and he was part of that. He was the starting nickelback for all the season, and kind of played some free safety, deep safety towards the end of the year in terms of his snap count, but primarily was their nickelback. I think that this is just a good depth piece. This is kind of what Cam Alexander was for last year's Oregon team.
Hmm.
But I think we, myself included, kind of got tricked by the not tricked, but assumed that Cam Alexander would have more of a role because he was somebody that was an early commitment to Oregon. So it seemed like like this is like basically free agency. Like you want to go get the guys who are really good right at the start. And so it seemed like Oregon really liked Cam Alexander last year, getting him early on in the process, but obviously didn't play that much, and obviously was the fourth or fifth corner on the team, which is a good thing to have when you have a multi-year starter as your fourth or fifth corner. Like that's pretty nice in case somebody goes down with injury. So I think that this is just a good solid depth piece. And like you said, Jadon's a good player. Like he's got years of
Mhm.
starting experience, and he played all last year in the SEC for one of the better defenses in the country. Um, I think there should be a relatively easy transition for him to come to Oregon. I think Ole Miss plays a very similar defense to what Oregon does in their kind of 4-2-5 nickelback scheme. And there's it was unexpected, but it's clear that they probably needed somebody back there. This is a secondary unit that, if let's say my predictions on who the depth chart's going to be are 100% correct, which they won't be, like that's going to be a
Mhm.
really young starting secondary.
Yeah.
You're obviously going to have Theron Johnson, the transfer from Northwestern, but your second corner is either going to be Jewel Florence or one of the true freshmen or Rod Plus, someone like that, a guy who doesn't have a lot of playing experience, and then safeties outside of Thieneman. It's going to be another by committee approach, I think, where it's just a lot of guys who have just very limited snap count numbers. And this provides some depth, some clarity, potentially with the star position and Dalen Austin and what's going on there. But I think it's a good addition, but I was pretty surprised it's somebody this late into the offseason where spring ball is a month, 6 weeks away from starting. So it's clear that Oregon came to the conclusion, like, we should probably get one more person here, and that's exactly what they did. And Chris Hampton got a guy that he knows, so I think it'll be fine. But we'll kind of find out eventually where he goes.
And just the last thing here, I did do a quick Q&A with Jared Redding from our Ole Miss site over on 24/7, and a couple things stood out. Was he's undersized at 5'10", 175. We should note that's a very light defensive back. That's a very light football player, right? Like that's 10 pounds heavier than Tez Johnson. This is somebody you're expecting to be able to make plays on run support and obviously tackle bigger
Mm-hmm.
receivers. But he was very complimentary of overall how he matched up despite that size. But it seems like the one cause for some concern is this is a heavily penalized player.
Oh
Does
yeah,
PFF track penalties, by the way, Jared?
sure does. Would you like to know?
Yeah, because he was
He's
saying
had
it was a problem.
So let's play a game. He's had 11 in his career. How many came last year?
This is DPIs or penalties, just all.
This is just penalties. I'm
Okay,
assuming most are probably
8.
DPIs.
I'll say
8,
8.
correct. 100%. Well done.
Wow.
Yeah, 8 penalties last year. Not great. Could be better.
Yeah.
Definitely one of the
So
things that kind of popped out to me. Because, he had 3 in his freshman year when he had 791 snaps. That's pretty darn good. But I think it was pretty clear based on his total penalties. And I think he had 11 or 12 PBUs last year that teams sought after him. Like they were going to go at him and try to to have their receiver make a play against him. And, he held his own, 23 receptions on 45 targets. That's a 51% completion percentage, allowed only 2 touchdowns, a long of 46, 89 yards after the catch. Like, that's basically 2 yards after the catch on every single reception. So it seems like he's a solid tackler. His tackle grade, kind of like all safeties, goes up and down throughout every game. You saw that with Oregon last year where Tysheem Johnson or Kobe Savage would have a great game. 8 or 9 tackles, maybe only missed 1. Their tackle grade for PFFs in like the high 70s, low 80s. And then, at the Rose Bowl, it seems like they never learned to tackle in their life. So it's kind of how safeties are. It's just the way it is. It's a difficult position to play. But it was clear that teams kind of targeted him last year against that Ole Miss defense. And, again, like that was a good defense. You're going to have to pick on somebody. And the same with Oregon. Like nobody was throwing at Jabbar Muhammad for most of the year. And they attacked Nico Reed. And Nico Reed was awesome last year. But, 8 penalties is a lot. That's something that popped out on the page when I first went into the details on it. But maybe he just doesn't play as often this upcoming year, and those penalty opportunities just aren't there. But certainly something, and that's interesting. I'm not surprised that our Ole Miss representative saw that as well, considering he watched all those games. But definitely something to be aware of, I would say.
Right. And I guess just the last thing I'd say, Oregon is in such an interesting spot in the secondary with just the number of unproven first, second year players. And pretty much all these are like blue chip several 5-star recruits in this group. Like this is a depth piece that makes sense. It's also like, would you be surprised if this is, I know you've mentioned his name already on this pod. This is another Cam Alexander where we kind of think coming in, he's a guy who's got starting experience, he'll probably play a lot. And then we look up at the end of the season, then he was just not really all that involved. Like that wouldn't be a surprising outcome for me at all. And I also wouldn't be surprised if this is like one of the leaders in snaps played, because under Dan Lanning, safeties and nickel players typically don't substitute in and out very much. So if he does have a role, this is a player you might be seeing out there all the time. And if he doesn't, this might be a player you just like forget is on the team almost. So I think a really interesting roster and kind of maybe almost like an inflection point for where this defensive back group works out. Because I think he's right on the cusp either way. It's like either he's a big part of this or he's not really all that involved at all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like he could be one of the leaders in snap counts next year. And I'm not exactly going to predict that. But again, this is a guy all year started at Ole Miss last year. Started for 2 years at Tulane, had that 1 year where he was, had a major injury. And then other than that, he's been on the field for over like 400, 500 snaps every single season. Like that's a real contributor on some real good Tulane teams and some real good Ole Miss teams, objectively speaking. And so he could be Cam Alexander where, he has 90 to 115 snaps played in a single season, or he could be the starting nickelback over Dalen Austin and have 600-700 snaps this upcoming season. It's a interesting, I wouldn't say predicament, but it's an interesting addition into the equation of who's going to play in the secondary next year. I don't know if he would crack the 2 deep. I just don't know. And that's kind of the thing at this point where it's like, I didn't know that they were still looking to add guys into the secondary. I thought that they got Thieneman, they got Theron Johnson. Like I figured that would kind of be it, and then the young guys would be there, and they would prefer the younger guys. But you never know with this program, with this coaching staff, and they've still got a couple spots available, I believe, on the 85 and the 105. So, which makes sense. Probably saving that for the spring transfer portal window. I should clarify. And, we'll see if they add any more in the secondary then. I think a lot of this will kind of work itself out during spring ball where guys see that, hey, the Jadon is a guy who's actually going to play a lot. Maybe I should go look at other options, or maybe he isn't and I should stay. So I think that'll all kind of get sorted out in the spring.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Let's take a quick little break here. And then we're going to get into some NFL draft stuff, which is, if you follow me on Twitter, I love talking about the NFL draft. So let's take a quick little break. All right. We are back here on this Wednesday edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast. Again, I am your host, Jared Mack, joined with Erik Skopil. and we are going to talk some NFL drafts, 2025 NFL draft stuff, where this is an overall very interesting draft class heading into the NFL. A lot of talent at the top, not a lot of quarterback talent. The class that I prefer, where you really don't know who's going to go 1 or 2 or 3. It's all kind of up in the air. But we're not here to talk about generals. We're here to talk about the Oregon Ducks and their draft prospects. So the entire football world is done with the Senior Bowls, the Shrine Bowl. Oregon sent 2 players to the Shrine Bowl in Jabbar Muhammad and Trayshawn Holden, and 6 players to the Senior Bowl in Dylan Gabriel, Terrence Ferguson, Josh Connolly Jr., Tez Johnson, Jamari Caldwell, and Jeffrey Bassa. I was hoping I would remember all of them. I did it.
Good work.
Jordan Birch and Johnny Cornelius were both invited and accepted bids or invites to the Senior Bowl, but did not participate. I know James Crepio wrote a story on it. I did not read it. I do not remember why they did not participate. But that's 8 players right there, 10 players total, where you have the idea that they will probably be drafted, which would break a program record. So I guess let's start with that, Eric. Do you think that they will break the program record of 8 players being drafted, which was set just last year heading into the 2025 draft?
Yeah, I do. And that was sort of the reason I thought it was worthwhile to jump on and do one of these is I have tiered this out, and I think we're just going to kind of run through some players and kind of say, where do we think they could go? What's the likelihood of rounds, et cetera. I have 13 players on my list that I think could be drafted. And like 6 of them are in that kind of wishy-washy range at the bottom. Maybe 5 of them actually are kind of in that range at the bottom. But I think it's very unlikely they don't have 8, that they don't break the record, I guess I'd say. Like 9, 10, 11, 12, like that all feels attainable. And I think speaks to why this was a really special team that was very deep. That was what we talked about all throughout the season. And we'll run through these names. They're basically going to have a representative at every single position group, like quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, offensive line, defensive line, linebacker, defensive back. I think that in itself sort of speaks to why this team was as successful as it was, why it went 13-0, was the number 1 team in the country, because it wasn't a team that until they faced a team like Ohio State, which if we were to be doing this process would have 8 guys in the first 2 rounds probably, or something like that. I don't know. I mean, maybe even more. I don't know. But it wasn't until they faced a team like that they rarely ran into issues. And I think that sort of speaks to what this team was this last year and just the depth of it all. Jared, I assume you're in agreement on, it seems almost unfathomable they don't get to 9 players drafted this year. I mean, just if you run through the names, which you're going to do, when you start getting down to 9 and 10, you're like, those guys are going to get picked, I think.
I think so, yeah. I mean, with the 10 guys that I just listed off, I don't see how any of those don't get drafted. Even a guy like Trayshawn Holden will likely be a day 3 pick or something like that. He's got size, he has speed, he has really good athleticism, and he can block. I mean, that's exactly what you want in a wide receiver, and especially not so much of a project with Trayshawn because he's a little bit older and is probably filled out his frame, and it's probably going to look like that throughout his playing days if he survives long enough in the NFL. But
sure,
that's a guy who you're gonna take somewhat of a flyer on in the 5th, 6th, 7th round because he does all the things that you want a wide receiver to do. He doesn't have the elite traits, but he has a lot of plus traits. I'll use a baseball analogy there. It's above average across the board. He doesn't have plus speed or anything like that, but he's big and strong and physical. So you look at those 10 guys. I don't see how they just wouldn't be drafted right off the bat, and that would shatter the record. And it's going to be interesting in years following if they'll come close to what they have in this 2025 class, because like you said, I think I'd like to hear the names on the bottom of your list, but that's 10. So that breaks the record by 2. And then you still have Oregon's Pro Day. And I was on the radio with Steve Tannen yesterday talking about this, where a guy like Jamal Hill last year comes out of nowhere, doesn't get invited to the combine or the Senior Bowl or anything like that, and runs a 4.41. He's 6'1", 230 pounds, 225 pounds, runs a 4.41 and gets drafted in the 7th round. Or Jordan Riley the year before. There's going to be plenty of opportunities for guys who are maybe at the bottom of the list, we call it, and get an opportunity at the pro day and show their stuff and impress some scouts or some coaches, some executives, and they're like, yeah, we'll take a flyer on that guy in the 7th round. So this could be 13. I don't know if it'll be more than that, but we'll see. We'll see. Let's kind of go through this list here.
Yeah, let's do it. And just before we start, you said something that was interesting of like, will future drafts get there? And I think that's going to be a really interesting point for us going forward because, under Dan, I think they've broken the record now. Certainly last year, I think the year before might have matched it. I think it was at 7.
Yeah, it was 6.
Right, 6. Okay, I forgot if it was 6 or 7. So we've seen improvements basically in record-breaking improvement now year after year, or year over year, I should say. If they get to like 11 or 12, 13, and we'll finish this podcast being like, could they get to 14, 15? That doesn't feel like a number that's realistic to be hitting regularly. But I also look at this team and go like, the way they're recruiting, it wouldn't be a shock to me if we have years where, there is a dozen or more players taken from an Oregon team, which again is, as somebody who's been around this program a long time, and I remember when it was like, hey, 2 guys got picked, what a great day.
That wasn't that long ago. That was,
you remember those days.
In the 2021 class with KT, was it 2021? Yeah, it was just him. He was the only guy drafted from Oregon that year. Granted, it was a top 6 pick, but that was it. Now you're looking at potentially 12 dudes off the board. Can I go on a quick rant before we jump into the list? You just
floor is
triggered
yours.
something in my brain.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult to be a team that always puts 10 to 12 players in the league, but that's the trajectory that Oregon is on. I just looked up on, The Athletic posted their top 100 players in the draft. Dane Brugler, who does really good stuff there. Ohio State has 12 guys, and that includes, Will Howard at 84. But, Oregon's got 6. So yeah, they're halfway there on that top 100 list. But these Ohio States, the Alabamas, the Georgias, even Notre Dame, the LSUs, those are programs that have been, at the top of college football for a long time, not only just on the field, but in recruiting. And while Oregon has recruited pretty darn well over the last almost a decade now, frankly, they are still they haven't been to the levels of what the Alabamas and Georgias are or Ohio States are, but they're getting there. The last 3-4 seasons under Dan Lanning and his recruiting classes, they are competing for that top 5 spot, that number 1 overall spot. And if that continues for another 4 or 5 years, you're going to see a lot of guys jump to the NFL because they're getting legit high-end, high 4-star, 5-star talent year in and year out. I mean, you wrote the article, Eric. There wasn't a single 3-star this year in their class for 2025, which is one of 2 times it's ever happened. Was that it? 2 times? Yeah.
Oregon this year, USC 2013.
Yeah. And this is not a USC love podcast, but back, in the early aughts and, the early 10s, like USC was a recruiting powerhouse, and they were producing a lot of talent into the league and that are still there, frankly. And that's the trajectory that Oregon is on. So I don't expect there to be years where only like 5 or 6 dudes get drafted. I think the new normal is going to probably be that 8 to 10 range. And it's going to start this year. I think next year there's going to be plenty of talent who could decide to leave early. There could be plenty of talent who's, an incoming transfer portal addition, or just guys who have been through the program who came in as a 4-star, a high 4-star under Dan Lanning in his first or second year. So that was just a quick little rant. Like Oregon is on that pace to get to that Georgia, Ohio State, and all the other Alabama, that kind of level of talent on their roster. And I think as long as Dan Lanning stays around, I think that'll just kind of be the norm.
All right, I've tiered this out day 1, day 2, day 3. And while also acknowledging there are probably guys in each of these lists that could be on a different list pretty easily. Like I think there are several players that are very borderline, and Jared, you can push back or kind of tell me what you've seen. I know you've been looking even more closely than I at some of the mock drafts and, as you said, top 100 lists and just the way people are talking about these prospects. But I think first round, there are 2 names, and they're both offensive linemen and both guys that just not offensive line, both linemen, and both guys that have foregone eligibility. And that's Josh Connerly, the offensive tackle, and Derek Harmon, the defensive tackle. Connerly seemingly at the Senior Bowl really made some impressions that were strong. I think the arm length was a big deal. I mean, this is a guy I've talked about before. He's only 6'4", which is frankly undersized for an offensive tackle in the NFL. But I think the arm length was, I don't have the data in front of me, but was enough, right? It seemed like the response and the reception to that measurement was like, okay, he can play tackle. And then you watch the movement skills, and aside from one rep, I know he got beat pretty bad. It was pretty good, and he had a good week.
Yeah.
It happens.
Yeah, he's got a 81-inch wingspan, 34-inch arms. So all that.
That works.
Great for a tackle. Great for a guy who's 6'4" as well.
So I think he's kind of moved himself, Jared, to being most likely a first round guy. Could still be second. It seems like he's like his range is like pick 25 to the very last pick of the first round from what I've seen. Jared, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then Harmon seemingly is a little bit more likely, I think, to be first round. It seems. Yeah. And his range seems like maybe 5 picks ahead of that, like pick 20 to 32. So it seems like the Ducks are likely to have 2 first-round picks, but I also could see it being a situation where one of these guys falls to early second or something.
Yeah, I think if anybody were to, I think it'd be Connerly falling to early second. Like Harmon, by all measures, like on-field production measurements at probably the NFL Combine, because he didn't need to go to the Senior Bowl. He's by all means like a first-round pick. He's either the second or the third defensive tackle on all of these big boards behind Mason Graham from Michigan and usually Kenneth Grant also from Michigan. Mason Graham's going to be like a top 5 pick. That guy is potential, like, I don't want to use generational, but going to be very much an impact guy from day one. And then I think, a lot of the picks come from team needs and just like what they prefer. And so some of the draft experts, a guy like Dane Brugler, has Harmon as the second defensive tackle. I've seen him as the third. I think that he's almost a mortal lock to be a first-round pick at this point. Like teams build through the lines. It's as simple as that. Unless there's some generational cornerback, like maybe a Travis Hunter type deal, you want offensive and defensive linemen. And Harmon was one of the most productive defensive linemen in the country last year. And that usually guarantees a first round pick, especially when he's not like 25 or anything like that. This isn't his 7th year in college. He had an extra year of eligibility, played 4 years in college, and then is gone, which is, how it should be and how it was. But he had 52 or 55 pressures this past season, according to PFF. That led the country from interior defensive linemen. He was like top 10 in total pressures, which includes every defensive player, which is usually out of this world to do as an interior guy. So I think he's about as close to a lock as I'll give for a first round pick. And then Connerly is just going to be team needs. This is not a great offensive tackle class. Honestly, I think the best offensive tackle is Josh Simmons at Ohio State, but he had season-ending injury against Oregon. So he could still find his way in the first round, but I think that helps Connerly because teams always need tackles, and he's enough of a project and is super mobile where you draft him as a tackle. Worst case, he moves to guard, and he could be a really good guard. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's 2 first-round picks, but I think he basically has that locked up.
Before we move to the day 2, just one more thing on Harmon. I mentioned earlier, like the measurements were important for Connerly. The fact that his arm length was what it was, and all of that. I think the cool thing with Harmon is, and again, he wasn't measured. I don't think, right?
No, he didn't go to the Senior Bowl.
There's not really like a needed. Like we don't need to see him hit a threshold because everybody knows he's plenty big, plenty strong, plenty athletic. Like all of that stuff is kind of built into the equation. So like I fully expect he's like 6'5", 320 is, and I think that was basically what he was listed at Oregon. And if that's what he actually measures in at, that's perfectly fine. That's great, honestly. That's above average. That's cool. We're cool. We're set. So there's no physical concerns with him, right? Because you talk about productive defensive linemen. If he was 6'1", 285, we'd be having a different conversation from a guy who's 6'5", 310, 320 pounds, whatever he ends up weighing at. All right. Day 2, I have 5 names, and I'll be honest, like you can convince me some of these guys should be on the day 3 list. I was just throwing players that I thought I've seen kind of in this range. Jordan Birch is the first name I've mentioned here. Tez Johnson, which is a player that has kind of picked up some steam, I think, as being a potential 3rd round pick, maybe even end of 2nd. with I think a really strong Senior Bowl. I know obviously the measurements are what they are, but gosh, it didn't seem like anybody could cover him, and that was obviously the story at Oregon too. And then I put these three guys who I guess maybe I'm a little bit curious to see what your response to me including them are. I've got running back Jadon James, tight end Terrence Ferguson, and then linebacker Jeffrey Bassa. And you can convince me those guys should be on the day 3 list pretty easily, but just based upon kind of the traits and the physical tools and kind of some of the stuff I've seen, it feels like it wouldn't be a surprise if these are 3rd round players when all is said and done.
Mm-hmm.
So how do those 5 names sit with you? Anything you'd do differently in terms of where you tier them?
No, I think those are good. I think they're all day 2, day 3 players. I think the highest trajectory is probably Birch going in the 2nd round. The other 4 feel like solid 3rd round candidates. Maybe Tez Johnson, depending what his 40-yard dash time is. Because if he goes, I don't know, if he goes sub 4.35, I'm sure that could spark some interest. Again, it's just his frame. He's so tight, like he's so slender and all that stuff, which has translated well for some players in the NFL. A guy like Devonta Smith for the Eagles was always kind of critiqued for how slender he was, but that didn't matter in college. It certainly doesn't matter in the NFL. And I want to kind of throw Tez in that camp because he never really got hurt at Oregon. He never really got hurt in his college career. He had that one injury against Michigan, where it was more of a collarbone thing, which is a little, kind of not the greatest in terms of what you want to see. But I think that he could maybe jump up to that round 2 selection. I know Dane Brugler with The Athletic. I'm going to keep mentioning that because that's the most recent one that came out. He's got Tez at 89, which would be a 3rd round pick, which I think falls pretty good for him. And then Ferguson's another dude who kind of made headlines at the Senior Bowl. Wasn't as often mentioned as Tez or Jeffrey Bassa, but he's what you want in a tight end. He's 6'6", 245 pounds, can run routes, can block pretty well. Like he's no Brock Bowers or Michael Mayer from Notre Dame a couple of years ago, but he's a good 3rd round pick. He's a guy you could, if you have the right quarterback, you could just plug and play. And he's really smart. He's a starter for 4 years, makes catches, can run routes well. Like I think he'd be a logical day 3 pick. And then Jadon James, I think, is going to be an interesting candidate as well because he's got the size that you want in a running back. It's different than Bucky Irving, who kind of measured small, but obviously he was great this year because he just has this innate ability to make tacklers miss that I think some teams just looked at the measurements and looked at the 40-yard dash time and were kind of afraid of that. And then you see him on the field and it's like, oh yeah, no, this guy knows how to play football. And we saw that all the time at Oregon. And we all knew that Bucky didn't have the top end speed to break away for a 70-yard touchdown run. And Jadon James kind of falls into a similar boat, but he has better size. I think he has better speed. At least we'll see when he runs the 40-yard dash. But this is a good running back class. And there has been a recent trend on drafting running backs, even though I hate it. It's been a big thing in the NFL. You have the Detroit Lions with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. You have Saquon Barkley with the Eagles and winning the Super Bowl. You had Josh Jacobs in Minnesota, who had a really good year for a really good team. And there's kind of been this resurgence on hey, let's get some running backs. And Jadon James might fall into that resurgence and get selected, maybe even in the 2nd round, depending on how he does at the combine. Then lastly, Birch. It's a tough year for Birch because this is a very, very, very deep defensive line class, but he has exactly what you want. He's 6'6", 285 pounds lining up on the outside. Yeah, I'll take that. And he had some injury issues in college, but nothing major, and was really productive when he played. So I think someone will definitely take a flyer on him. He's got to learn to be a little bit more or have some more finesse in his game. He's more power, more speed to power than speed to finesse or power to finesse, but he's got it. He's got all the physical intangibles you'd want. And if DJ Johnson was a 3rd round pick, I think Jadon Birch can be a 2nd or 3rd round pick.
I guess I have 2 main curiosities from these names. One is, what does Tez run in the 40? Because I think that's going to be very important for whatever he ends up being. Because he's not going to. The other measurables are not only not going to blow people away, they're probably going to be almost a deterrent, just because I think he was 5'9", 165 at the Senior Bowl,
Yeah.
which is just that's just like 1% level size for the position. And so I'm curious of what he runs. And the thing that's interesting too is the big comparison. You mentioned a couple of them. The other one that's been pretty prevalent is Tank Dell, the Houston Texans receiver. And I wonder what the recent injury history with Dell does to, and I'm not saying this is fair because they're two different human beings and their injury histories are obviously very different, but does the fact that Tank Dell was lost to, I think, an MCL tear last year and then like broke his leg in a really gnarly fashion this year, might not play at all in 25. Like, small players, injury concerns are always already there. Could that kind of heighten some of this for Tez? I'm curious on if that enters the discussion at all. But I do think, based upon what he's put on the football field when he's healthy and what he did against a really good Penn State defense in the Big Ten championship game with everything on the line, like somebody's going to fall in love with this guy and be like, we're not letting him get by the end of the third round. So, but the 40-yard dash is curious for me. And then for James, like, does he go higher than Bucky is a question that I've got. And I think I could see it going a variety of ways. Frankly, I thought Bucky was drafted a little lower than I had anticipated. But this year's draft class is, as you said, Jared, much better at the running back position, like significantly better. There wasn't a running back taken early last year. There's 1 to 2 running backs that could be first-round picks probably this year. And then a slew of guys. Like, I don't know, like, what's the range of what draft pick he goes as a running back? I think it could be anywhere from like the 6th to the 10th running back. And if he's further on the backside of that, then he's probably not a day 2 pick. But does he go ahead of Bucky, who was, I think I had it pulled up, pick 125 last year in the 4th round?
Something like that.
Somewhere in the 120s, I think. I would expect he would go higher than that because, as you said, he does have more size, and I'm going to guess he's going to test better in the straight line speed, even though that wasn't, frankly, something he got to utilize hardly at all at Oregon. We've run through the stat that they were like one of the worst teams in the country for running back explosive run plays, and he never really got it going there. But I bet you he'll run better than Bucky. So I'll be curious to see. We've talked about it before, like which player had a better NFL future, which player would be drafted higher. I think we kind of had mixed opinions when we did this last year. I'll be very curious to see where Jordan ends and just kind of that comparison with Bucky, since we made it several times while he was here.
Mm-hmm. I forgot, did you threw Bossa on this day 2, day 3 list?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that'll be the one that's the most interesting, because I don't think Jeff has a position in the NFL yet. I think a team is either going to have him really try to bulk up, like add another 15, 20 pounds, or drop him. And kind of what the Texans plan to do with Jamal Hill, where it's like, hey, we're going to put you back at safety, but you're going to be a big safety. And that's good and bad for Jeff, because A, he's played safety and knows the position, but B, it's, he's been a linebacker the last couple of years. He's
4 years
completely changed his body to being a linebacker, a full-time linebacker, and has done pretty well at it. Which I just don't know if, because linebackers people don't want to draft linebackers. They can go get them in the 3rd and 4th round, which might be what Jeff's case is. But I think it'll be interesting. If it were up to me, and if I were a general manager, I would have Jeff drop weight and make him a big linebacker who knows how to play, or a big safety and know how to play linebacker, and just be not a nickel because he's not fast enough, but maybe like a strong safety and just come down in the box and stuff. But I think he could totally be a round 3 pick, which would be awesome. It'd be a great development for Jeff, and another testament to Oregon's player development as well. But he's the one guy on the list I could see maybe falling to round 4.
I could absolutely see him falling to round 4. I mean, I could see him falling to 4. I could see Jordan falling to 4. I could see Ferg falling to 4. Frankly, I could see Tez maybe falling to 4 if people are as concerned as I think they might be about the size stuff. Like, he's such I don't want to say frustrating. He's such a strange case of, like, everybody knows he is probably one of the 100 best players in this draft based upon, and probably a top 50 player based upon purely like production. And what we saw.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you go, but he's also like not built really like anybody else in the league for this position. What does that translate as? I just find that to be fascinating. I think it's really exciting that he's pretty much a lock to be drafted, because I know that just being around him for the last year, I know he was really motivated off of Bo's first round pick. I remember doing that interview. Gosh, I think that was the spring game, was like right around like a day after maybe he was taken, and just kind of seeing what Tez's mindset was coming out of that. Like that would be such a cool kind of way to conclude that story. So he's probably the most fascinating guy maybe in this entire draft from an Oregon perspective of where he goes, because I do think there's a fair amount of range. There might be a team that's like end of second and like, we just love this guy, we don't have another pick we're gonna be able to get him with, let's take him here. Or there could be, I could see him falling, and it's a decently deep receiver draft. It's not top end talent like it was last year, but the depth is solid. So okay, let's move to the last group, which I've kind of termed as like 4 through 7 to undrafted. I've got 6 names, and actually I just wrote down a 7th because you said something earlier that kind of piqued my interest of maybe this could be a guy who somehow gets picked. This list is, I've got Dillon Gabriel, I've got Trayshawn Holden, I've got a Johnny Cornelius, I've got Jabbar Muhammad, I've got Jamari Caldwell, and then I threw in Nico Reed at the very end as my 6th name. It's just kind of that maybe probably would have to maybe perform better at the pro day, kind of in that same Jamal Hill vein of like, maybe he has a good individual workout, but this is a guy who was like really productive. I know he's very undersized. I'm guessing NFL, if he is going to fall, be able to carve out a role, it'll be back at kind of nickel where he was primarily in 23 for Oregon, just because of some of the size concerns. But that's a player who I think played himself at least into the conversation of being drafted. So, and then of course, like we should start with Dillon Gabriel, Jared. Like this is to be a really fascinating name. Like Oregon's history with quarterbacks would suggest you should take an Oregon quarterback. Like the last 3 or 4 that have gone out have been really good players. And obviously the most recent 2 have like set NFL records for early production. No one's expecting that from Dillon Gabriel, but this guy was a Heisman Trophy candidate. We all understand, similar to Tez, the size constraints and some of the concerns there, and maybe some of the arm strength constraints or concerns, but like very, very productive, obviously an extremely self-confident, self-aware person, and somebody who's got like a lot of experience, a ton of experience, more experience than anybody else playing this position at the college level. Like I think there's several things that are holding him back from probably having a chance to go in the second day, but like I would be really surprised if he's undrafted, and I kind of think he'll go like mid 4th to early 5th. And again, maybe there's a case where he could end up day 2, but I probably would be surprised if he ends up a 2nd or a 3rd round pick.
Yeah, I'd be stunned if he were a 2nd or 3rd round pick. He just doesn't have. There's not a lot going for him physically, like in his intangibles. He's shorter. He's not as mobile, like compared to a guy like Jalen Milroe, who wasn't a great passer, but is a hell of an athlete. His arm strength.
By the way, Jared, those 2 guys are like the total opposite prospects. Yes. Like could not be more opposite.
Yeah, but somebody is going to talk themselves into Jalen Milroe because he's electric in the open field and is an unbelievable athlete at the quarterback position. Gabriel is could be potentially a very traditional pocket passer in the NFL. He's not going to get out and run. Even though we saw it at Oregon, he's just a smaller bodied fella. And he's got all this experience, though, which has become, kind of all the rage in the NFL again after seeing what Bo Nix, what Michael Penix looked like this past year, what Jaden Daniels looked like this past year. Guys who had 4 to 5 years of either starting or real playing experience, 6 in this case for Dillon Gabriel. That could be a positive for him, but he's going to interview well. I bet you every team's going to really like how he interviews and like him as a human being. But it's going to be how he tested the combine and how he throws. I think his arm strength is limited, and I think that could probably be a reason as to why Oregon didn't really stretch the field vertically. I know that he made a lot of good throws, but there's a difference in arm strength between him and Bo Nix, and people questioned Bo Nix's arm strength last year, even though he made all the throws in the football field and went vertical. You're looking for guys who have elite arm strength at the quarterback position, and he just doesn't. His arm strength is fine. It's not a bad thing, but
it's not bad.
But for the NFL perspective, which is completely different from the college football perspective, like he doesn't have a lot of the traits that you would ideally want in somebody who's going to be a day 2 quarterback or even a day 1 guy. But I wouldn't be surprised if he gets drafted. Just a flyer late. Yeah. Just a guy who knows how to read a defense, knows how to make every play, did pretty well at the Senior Bowl this last week, impressed some people. And he's just got to do it again at the combine on the biggest stage. And he's shown to do pretty darn well on the biggest stage, and even including the Rose Bowl, where he was harassed by Ohio State's defensive line the whole game. He did really well. I have a question for you.
Hmm.
Of those 5-6 guys that you listed,
Yeah.
who could you see potentially moving up in the draft process?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I think the two names that popped off just looking at it, and this is mainly based upon physical traits and position like attractiveness, would be a Johnny and Jamari probably.
Mhm.
I throw Trayshawn out there if he runs like 4.4 or something shocking. Like if he just blow, because he's got the size and
Yeah.
honestly, like in the open field, every time he caught the ball, like on a screen or a slant and ran, you're just like, this guy's a little bit more explosive, a little more juice than I think we gave him credit for. So like, I wouldn't be surprised if he runs, if he like performs really well in some of those speed and agility drills, like he could be somebody. But I look at a Johnny who was frankly a name who we weren't expecting to be in this range probably going into the season. This was somebody who was looked more at like in that second or third round range. Maybe he's having an awesome season. He's a first round pick. I think there was some of that last year. So I think, and so he obviously has the physical traits, did not have a very good season. I do think the Ohio State game probably is going to be a deterrent for him just because it
For
was
sure.
really, really bad. So if teams can get over that and still look at like, hey, this is a very mature, intelligent, experienced right tackle who athletically maybe is like I don't want to say challenged, but just not quite. He's definitely not Josh Connerly, but he's got the size and the history of being a successful player. He's a good run blocker. Like I could see someone talking themselves into him as a third round pick. And I just throw Caldwell out there, and he's probably going to be somebody that needs to. I don't want to say reshape his body, but like I would think they probably want him 5 to 10 pounds lighter. But the explosiveness and the power was always there for him at Oregon, and I could see a team going like, you can't really teach 6'3", 330 pounds in the middle of the defense. We don't really like any other defensive tackles in this range. Let's take a shot at him in the third. So I would say those two would probably be the ones just kind of off the cusp that kind of stood out for me.
Yeah, those are the 3 names if you included Cornelius, because I had Trayshawn and Jamari. I think Trayshawn, if he can train to run a 40-yard dash and maybe drop some weight and run something in the 4.4s, like I think he could potentially move up. Guy who has a lot of experience, who had some personal trouble with his time at Oregon with a couple one off field, one on field incidents. It's not necessarily the best look, but a guy who has clearly matured over his time compared to what it was at Alabama.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yep.
an awesome interview, and will probably interview great with teams. Was a full-time starter this year. Was really good when given the opportunities, like in the Rose Bowl, against Michigan, like when Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart went down. Like he was a legitimate number 2 option and torched some of the better defenses in the country. And I think that he's got all the intangibles that you want. Isaac Streeter of the Portland Tribune told me that he's like the perfect San Francisco 49ers wide receiver because he's big bodied, he can block, and he's willing to do the dirty work. And I think a lot of teams are going to like that when they're watching his tape. And then Caldwell, to me, is a guy I think is just kind of criminally underrated. His stats don't really show it, and that's kind of the problem with being a defensive tackle and the nose. But boy, was he disruptive. I mean, he got into the backfield a lot. I know he didn't register a sack, but had 5.5, 6.5 sacks his prior year at Houston.
Yeah.
A bunch of pressures. I think was 3rd or 4th in the team in pressures this year. Was just a stud on the interior. And like you said, you can't teach height. You can't teach the ability for that guy to move that well at 330, 340 pounds. Kind of reminds me of why Jordan Riley was picked. Like, wasn't that impressive of a player at Oregon. Had a good pro day, showed that he could take up 2 blocks at a time and do something in the run game and kind of get after the passer. Like, that's what you want in an interior defensive lineman. And I think he has a chance, depending on what he runs at the combine and the 40-yard dash and his shuttle time. I think he has a chance to kind of break through in that 3rd round potentially. It's just a big body guy who can get after it in the interior. And like I said earlier, you want those people, man. You want guys who can get after the quarterback on the interior. It makes life so much easier. And for Cornelius, I think it would behoove him to move to guard because I don't think he has the athleticism to play tackle. And that's not saying he's not a good athlete, because he's very clearly a very good athlete. But like you said, he just, he doesn't move like Connerly, who can get out there and has the basketball background and all that. But he's still 6'5". He's still almost 300 pounds. Like, if you move him inside, like, I think that could be a really good spot for him because he got the wingspan, he's got the length, he's got the mobility to at least perform there. He just probably isn't a tackle, and that's okay because look at TJ Bass. TJ Bass played tackle his entire time here at Oregon, basically, or his final season specifically. That dude hated playing tackle. He wanted to
Jadon.
play guard. Oregon just didn't have another tackle on the roster. And now he's playing guard for the Cowboys and is kind of holding up his own as a guy who was undrafted. Like, different body types for sure. But there's an easier transition from tackle to guard than guard to tackle. And I think Ajani could make that and showcase his talents there. I think it's, interesting that he didn't go to the Senior Bowl. That could have been somebody telling him, his agent, teams telling him that, like, hey, you're good. Don't worry about this. Like, we'll take you in this round, whatever it may be. But if he goes to the combine, which I would assume he will, and depending on what he runs, what he weighs in at, what he measures at, like, he could be a guy who could move up. But for the other guys on the list, I think those are all day 3 candidates. That's not a bad thing either. And I think Nico, it'll depend because just like Jabbar, like, they're both on the shorter side.
Mhm.
And while that works, a guy like Clark Phillips at Utah, who's a real rotational cornerback for the Atlanta Falcons, like, he was a shorter guy too, but was more productive in college than both Jabbar and Nico, at least in his final season, and was an absolute stud. So there's a path there for sure. It depends on what they run, what they measure in at, and everything like that. But I could see him working his way up, and that would give 13 Ducks off the board, which would be very impressive.
So for listeners, we've run through 13 names. How in the world do 5 or more not get drafted to break the record? I mean, it's just not happening. Like, if you go, like, you're going to convince me in that bottom group, like 5 of the 6 don't get drafted, and that's so you don't break or tie the record. I just don't think it's plausible. So that was why it was fun to do the exercise, just to go through it and go, like, yeah, they're getting more than 8. And frankly, like, I think 11 or 12 feels extremely attainable. And I still think Nico, like, he's at a case. And then I wrote down a couple more names just as we were going, Jared.
Yeah, let me hear him because I was trying to think of more names as well.
Well, like you mentioned, Jamal Hill kind of impressing people with some of the intangibles and the measurements at the pro day. Like, what if Justin Jacobs at 6'4", 245 goes out and runs like a 4.46 or something? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, is that somebody just based upon the physical tools? I know, like, he frankly just didn't play a whole lot at Oregon during his 2 years here. I think if you were to run through like the transfer portal additions Oregon's made under Lanning and then rank them from like most productive to least productive, like he's the back half of that. Like, he didn't end up showing out the way he thought. This is a really big time player who came over from Iowa and had hurt his knee. And I don't know if he like ever really was as explosive or as, kind of as impactful as we thought he would be. But does that mean he can't be an NFL player? No. And I do think he has some NFL traits with the size and athleticism that he has. So that would be a name that I could see. Another one for kind of the same reason would be Dante Manning, who was previously a 5-star. I bet you that guy will run well and test well. I know we've talked about it before on interviews. Like, I think his wingspan was like 6'10" or something like that. And he's only 5'11". So like, he's got some of the physical tools that are really intriguing. Like, you could convince me he's somebody who winds up kind of on a list. And then this last one is like 95% a joke, but also just acknowledging that sometimes there's nepotism in the world. Like, could Patrick Herbert get drafted by somebody just because it's like, it's Justin Herbert's brother? We've got to have him on the team. I'm kind of joking.
That's a UDFA.
That's it. Yeah. Well, that's also a Bronny James kind of acknowledgement for people down in Los Angeles. But no, he's a UDFA. Those were the 2 that I kind of thought of, Jacobs first and then Manning, as we're kind of running through the corner stuff. Because I think you could convince me, not based upon on-field player production, but that based upon physical traits, Dante might have more intriguing traits than both Muhammad and Nico.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's very interesting. Like, he obviously didn't, live up to the 5-star billing that he once had, but was a productive player in college. He stayed here for 5 years and was predominantly like the backup cornerback, but not that that's necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, he has all the physical traits that some team might want. And I don't think he'll be invited to the combine, but at the pro day, very similar to Jamal Hill, like, if he rips off something in the 4.3s, like, because he was one of the better athletes on the team always, and just never put it really together on the field, and that could be for a whole bunch of reasons, but he still has all the physical tools. I was thinking of Brandon Johnson potentially as a guy,
Sure.
just if the defense plays a nickel system, and he was pretty disruptive at nickel in his college career at Duke and then at Oregon. That could be another guy who might test well at a pro day, and then a team is just kind of infatuated with it and has one of the later picks in the 7th round. They're like, sure, why not? But I think that's it. The other people I was thinking of was maybe Nashad Strother and Marcus Harper, but I don't really see it. I think they're both undersized guards who aren't mobile enough.
I think strangely Strother has a better chance of getting drafted than Harper based upon this recent season's production, at least.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Strother was actually really good this year. I don't think
he was.
Give him credit. Yeah,
no,
he was awesome this year. Which again, if he runs well, if he tests well, you never know. I just think he's a little on the shorter side, not as agile as you'd like. But again, it's the NFL draft. There's a lot of projects that are taken every single year. There's going to be projects taken in the first round, but with a guy like Nashad or Marcus Harper, both guys are 5th, 6th year players. Like there's not a lot of projection in there. So there might be somebody who falls in love with them, but I don't know. Those are the only other guys I thought of while going through the roster. No Pat Herbert here.
That was 99% a joke. Just to bring it up, because it's like, sometimes in LA they pick guys who are related to other guys, and that's the only reason.
Just might.
Just kind of wrapping this up, just kind of final thoughts here. First, Jared, you're going to have a lot of these shells to prep for the draft this year. You're going to have like 15 or 16 names.
Yeah.
You're going to have a lot, which is encouraging. And then the other thing is, I just think broadly as we ran through this, you realize like the majority of starters from this Oregon team that left are players that are NFL draft talents, right? Like that's a shift from, we just talked about earlier, like even a couple of years ago where it would be like maybe 9 guys, 10 guys are off to, finish up eligibility. And it's like, well, 4 sign UDFAs, 6 don't go anywhere, and 2 get drafted. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. This is a case where Oregon's going to have lost, gosh, I forget what the count. It's like 15 or 16 starters from this last year's team. Like it's the majority of the team is gone. And pretty much all of them have a chance to get drafted. And I think like legitimately going through this exercise, I would be surprised if fewer than 12. Like I think Nico is very much borderline. I think the other 12 that we ran through, I'll just say them again: Connerly, Harmon, Tez Johnson, Jordan James, Terrence Ferguson, Jordan Birch, Jeff Bossa, Dylan Gabriel, Trayshawn Holden, Johnny Cornelius, Jamari Caldwell, and Jabbar Muhammad. Like I just don't see any of those guys not being picked. So
I'm the same way.
I think you're going to see a dozen guys selected this year. And considering Oregon's lost, I think it's 16 starters, like that's 3/4 of your outgoing starters are going to be guys who get picked. And that just to me signals like how good this team was and where this program is at right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's on the up. And I mean, there's some real good players too. They were spectacular in their Oregon careers, spectacular in the places that they played beforehand as well. It's just a lot of really good talent, and a lot of those guys came back for a national championship. Obviously, it didn't happen, but I think almost all of them improved their draft stock. If I were to say, I think the only guy who maybe didn't was a Johnny, maybe Jabbar, but all of those guys they improved their draft stock. They showed what they could do in Dan Lanning's defense, and it's a good point for Dan if he's talking to a recruit, like, hey, look at this. All these guys are under me, and that was just in 2-3 years time with our coaching here. So I think it's looking up. It'll be interesting to see how many get selected, but I agree with you. I think it's really hard to anticipate not seeing those 12 guys off the board, and then anything else would just be gravy on top.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be super fun. I'm probably more excited for this draft. Well, last year was fun too, but just these last couple where there's going to be a ton of ducks going, it adds a little bit of flavor for for some time, in the past maybe hasn't been quite that way.
Yeah, it sure hasn't. All right. That's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you all for listening or watching. If you like the show, please leave a comment down below on the YouTube video. Leave a 5-star review wherever you are listening, whether that's Spotify, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Apple Music, whatever you do. So once again, please leave a review, like, favorite, whatever, do all that good stuff. And thank you all for listening.
Talk to you later, folks.